How far would you go to protect the ones you loved? To save an innocent life? Would you risk yourself, knowing that your actions could very well kill you? Would you be willing to make deals with literal devils to buy precious moments to figure out a game plan? What would you do? On the last segment of this, I shared some of the more gruesome incidents that started me down this path. A life where, instead of trying to peer at the man behind the curtain, I tripped and fell, practically ripping the curtain down in the process. Then let my own curiosities, my own motivations, start messing with every button and lever to see how the machines worked on the other side. This was dangerous on so many accounts. And there was not a mentor for me to bounce off of. There was not a parent figure I could go to ask about these things. There was not anyone. I had to figure these actions out on my own. And all of my reactions were done with the best intel I could gather. Were pushed forward with only the motivation to understand what was going on and maybe help as many people as I could along the way. But unfortunately, the risk became too much for certain people to bear. And as a time in a young man's life where he's starting to figure out who he is, getting into high school, should be worrying about what he's gonna wear to the next big date, or figure out what's gonna happen, or how to make moves on his crush at prom. I was getting involved in police investigations, looking into satanic rituals, rumors of young ladies being stabbed multiple times by their significant others as part of some sort of satanic ritual, left for dead on the side of the road, and the only thing that kept them alive and kept them bleeding out was the fact that it was freezing cold temperatures. I wish I was exaggerating these details. I wish it didn't have to come down this road. I've had time to process these things and realize that these events had to transpire to form me into something that could be able to handle that load. But the consequences, the reverberations throughout reality itself, can still weigh heavy on the heart. In order to tell this next sequence of events most accurately, I'm going to have to jump back in time a little. You may have noticed that in several instances I've had to do that in order to provide full context. None of these instances were simple one and done. They were all individual threads weaving together, each thread a story of its own, afflicting others which it was sewn into. Roughly 5 years ago, towards the end of 2019, I started coming forward a bit more about my situation with my daughter, telling the story to the best of my ability, basically just sharing what I knew at the time. At the time is when the main theory behind the Olivia paradox was that somehow my daughter was able to move back in time in order to save my life, potentially with the aid of some form of divine intervention, as many speculated that it was the Archangel Michael who assisted her. And maybe to some extent he did. In fact, that was likely the reason why my wife decided to name our son Michael, or at least that's his earth name. His name upstairs may be something very similar, but it's a matter of his own preference. My first official outing with this story was with a YouTube channel known as Strange But True Stories. I saw that they were looking for stories of paranormal encounters, thought I'd submit mine, because maybe me coming out and talking about it would somehow lure out the mother. Because again, the main theory I was working on was that blood relatives of my daughter who had somehow found themselves in the final moments of life, whether they managed to come back from the dead or not, were able to see her. It was the best I had with what information was available to me. Like I said, I didn't exactly have a lot of mentors that I could bounce ideas off of. Many of the ones I did try to reach out to pretty much just spun some version of New Age concepts. They didn't try to actually dig into it. Granted, it was a situation where I found out the ordeal through an attempt on my own life. And in order to recreate those circumstances to the satisfaction of mainstream science means crossing a few moral and ethical boundaries. When I started to share the story, a couple of the people I had already helped through my investigations apparently heard it, realized it was me, and started sending in their own stories involving. And I had already started gathering individuals who were going on to forums on the internet telling people who had extreme cases to come find me, almost religiously. I had also noticed that there was quite a few people who assumed that another individual, who admittedly does sound a lot like me, I was trying to play a game of identity theft. One woman went as far as try to email me personally and out me right then and there, but she had no evidence, even though the guy came forward and admitted that, yeah, we're two different people. Maybe we were related somehow, but that is another story for another time. One of the cases that was brought forward to me was a young man out of Nevada. He was right over the Idaho border, so I could plan a day trip on my days off from work in order to visit him in person. He was concerned that some sort of demonic entity was following him. He would have animals react. Animals would change their reactions around him. Say, stray cats that would maybe walk up to him and let him pet him would all of a sudden become very hostile, panicky, as if something much more powerful and evil was hanging about. He would swear that up and down that he would see what looked like this big dog following him. He would have these weird dreams, weird scratches, and get this. A friend of his tried to put together a jade necklace for protection. During an incident where the entity in question seemed particularly pissed off, this thing grabbed the protection necklace and obliterated it, practically atomized it. He showed me proof. He showed me photos. And it was one of those things where the only thing that could make that type of damage is one of those hydraulic compressors, like you would see on social media videos where they would crush random objects. He would try to go to his friend to explain to him what happened, see maybe if his friend could make another one, but once he realized how powerful this particular entity was, he completely shut him out. An extreme response, but justified when you realize everything that happened afterwards when he reached me. He genuinely thought I was just going to ignore him like everybody else. Something in my gut told me that this was a legitimate case and this dude needed some serious help. Before I had a chance to drive down there and see the situation for myself, I started trying to ask him the typical questions. What did this thing do? Tell me about these dreams that are manifesting. Was there certain times that he seemed a lot more active? You say it was mostly active at night. The dreams seemed like he was in this dark pit. One dream that stuck out above the rest was that this being, he was sat in front of this table with what looked like a contract signed on parchment paper it was sealed in this glass case. This entity showed itself, said, "You're not getting out of this unless you sign." He tried to say, "No, I'm not signing that. I'm not signing that." This thing got pissed. He grabbed him by the hand, slammed it into the glass to where his blood became his signature. Now, fucked up dream, right? Explain him having a bloody hand that looked like he just punched a window. He was able to prove that this in fact happened. And honestly, this dude was too afraid. He was too afraid for this to have been completely falsified. Eventually, he started going into some research on his own, trying to understand what this thing was. Who was he dealing with? Then he found a picture online that he said matched the dog almost identically, especially as the dog would start to walk up on its hind legs. No, not a werewolf. Much, 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 much worse. He identified this being as Vapula. Vapula was a well-known demon within the Keys of Solomon. very powerful, very angry night demon. And it was speculated, according to the lore, that Vapula was actually one of the Nephilim meant to have been destroyed in the flood. So this thing, he had a history of betrayal and he carried a fucking grudge. I had all the information I needed in order to start piecing together an exorcism ritual. I feared that I was going to have no other choice. This thing had a grapple on this poor kid, and it was holding tight. It was going to get ugly. It was going to get brutal, and somebody wasn't going to walk away from this. Not 100%. They weren't going to be able to walk away without some injury. Best case scenario. I made the drive, interviewed this kid personally, took on his family. Nice kid, didn't get involved in drugs, wasn't necessarily involved in any domestic violence issues directly. There was a little bit of family history that led to his parents getting divorced, but that was about it. Mostly a Buddhist upbringing, so he was confused on how to handle that with everything going on. Then we focused overnight. We sat him back, and Vapula was pissed that I was there. Started to possess the kid. I watched this kid's skin darken, like it was almost rotting before my eyes. You could see the look in his eyes. His eyes were changing. His face was changing. It was a full-on exorcism. It was a full-on possession, exorcism imminent. So I started making a move. I started demanding this thing identify who it was. Started interrogating it. Some of you may go, it's like, no, Dakota, you don't want to give a name to a demon. That makes it more powerful, blah, 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 blah. It also makes you more powerful if you know what the hell you're doing. You identify a demon. Sometimes you can also identify a counter angel. It's like, you can just call. Some of you may say, just call upon Archangel Michael. You seem to have some sort of connection to him. Michael, if you follow the Christian lore directly, was a general, but he was smart. Assuming Michael was a physical being, he would know who to send down to take care of this thing personally, if not him himself. I started to get the being out, commanding it. I physically put my hands on this kid, which a lot of sources say is a no-no, as the possession can transfer over to you through physical touch, like some sort of viral infection. I started focusing my hands on the sides of this kid's head. Tried jumping into his mind to rip the thing out myself. And if I could tell you what it looked like, I was able to grab a hold of something and start pulling the thing out of him. You would just see this black mass separating from this thing's body, like comparing it to the shadow of the Disney version of Peter Pan. It's sugarcoating it beyond belief. I would be delusional to say if that was it entirely. The separation caused both him and the kid. He was younger than me, just a few years younger than me, but you could tell he was a young soul. It was hurting him and the kid, but I had to make a move fast because this thing, if it kept a hold, would have killed him. It wanted to kill him. It wanted to kill me, especially when it saw what I could do. Eventually, I got the separation, was able to separate the entity from the kid. Before I could appropriately send it away, it broke free. It got away. But it was not going to be the last I dealt with it. I helped this kid, managed to convince him to get some protein in his diet, rebuild his strength, and to take things easy for a few days. He was going to need it. I was going to need it too. But I needed to focus on him, make sure he was okay. A few days later, I was back at home. It wasn't a few days. It was about a week later. I was sitting at home, just trying to relax, trying to go to bed, normal night. Then all of a sudden, this dream starts to manifest. I was in what looked like a Nazi concentration camp that was overrun. Is how I need to describe it. It was possibly, in retrospect, it was likely some kind of Japanese internment camp. but it was overgrown with nature. I was walking through trying to figure out first off, why the hell was I there? And all of a sudden I started hearing this radio playing. So I followed the noise. It sounded like old 1940s music being played on like some sort of retro radio station or something. I don't know. I managed to go into some of the bunks that was completely empty except a little boombox on the ground, relatively newer looking. Voice in my head managed to get through to me. And I say that because it was like a broken radio transmission. It said, Dakota, you need to pay attention. You are being targeted right now. Something is trying to get you. Then the signal was cut off from me. I listened to it. And as soon as that transmission was cut off, the radio started acting up, like some sort of interference. Then I started hearing a laughter behind it, coming through the static. I looked directly at it, said, who's there? Started laughing more. I said, God damn it, tell me who is there right now. It started laughing even harder. This was a game to him. The game was just about to begin. Then I went old school Catholic exorcism. Said, in the name of Jesus Christ, I demand you tell me who the fuck you are. In this low, guttural voice. Think of the deepest, like, black guy voice you can think of, and have that voice be affected by years of chain smoking. Level deep, guttural. It growls at me, realizing that I'm building up strength. Says it's Vapula, bitch. This black shadow mass rushes out of the radio, hits me, is able to knock me into a waking state. Next thing I know, I'm hanging above my bed, pinned to the wall, by my throat, by this thing. And it was squeezing. I tried to fight, hit the side of its arm. I tried grabbing at its hand. I could physically feel animal leather when I grabbed this thing. It had a physical manifestation to it. Tried prying it off. Vapula was only there for one reason and one reason only. And as the more I continued to fight, the harder he squeezed. I used my last inch of breath to go, Michael, please. The next thing I know, there is this piercing sound in the air, like microphone being held too close to a speaker feedback. It had that pitch to it. The air itself was vibrating like a mirage. Something was taking a hold of me now. Something powerful. Made my skin glow. I could feel myself changing. I could even see the light, the room around me being lit up as if some light was physically coming out of me. It just kept getting brighter, brighter. And Vapula was losing his grip on me. The next thing I know, I'm grabbing it by the head and squeezing. And he let out this absolute blood-curdling squeal, like pigs in a butcher house. Then it stops. I pass out. The next morning I wake up. I'm in a funky position in my bed, and I get up to, get out of the house. It was a weekend, springtime. It was time that I go mow the lawn. One of my next door neighbors, she was aware of some of my supernatural activities. She thought it was cool that I did that type of stuff, but she didn't know the exact extent. She sees me out there, realizes I'm up and moving, and said, she comes to me and says, Dakota, are you okay? I said, yeah, why? I initially wrote off that what happened the night before is just some weird nightmare. So I was confused. I didn't know what she was asking me. So I heard some stuff coming from your house last night in this bright light. The house I was in at the time, it was like there was one of my neighbors their house was like only 10 feet away. It was like it was a shared property at one point with a guest house, and the landlord that we had at the time, he bought both properties and sold them as well as different for different renters. The room I was in at one point wasn't likely a back porch before it was renovated. Her house was literally 10 feet from me. And she goes, "Keeps going to tell me." It's like, "Yeah, I heard like this squealing, and all of a sudden there was like it was a bomb went off or something." Because I saw this light, and even my dogs are afraid to come out because they saw it. I look behind her, and one of her dogs is watching where the window where my bedroom was, and that thing was scared of something coming out. I told her what happened. You could see the fear in her eyes. She may have been a fan of the show Supernatural, but hearing it that there was a level of legitimacy to it scared the hell out of her. She didn't want to hang around me too much afterwards. She was still polite, all that, but if she had any curiosity about me, she was well deterred away, which was probably the smartest decision on her part. Because something about that event, well, let's just say, the other side gets to be quite gossipy.
Within the week after Kane's appearance, after the confirmation that the being known as the Hat Man was none other, I received a visitor that only added to the confusion. How intense this battle was going to be was something I could not prepare for, had it not been for this woman. It was within a week after the father helped me confirm Kane's plans and Kane's identity. There was a morning where I was getting home from work, as usual. Then as I go to enter my bedroom, there's this portal that's open. I could just barely make out what was through the other side. It looked awful dark. Wasn't anything evil. It was just like it was purposely made for me to not be able to see. And out steps this woman. Yeah, figures. I'm alone in the bedroom, and all of a sudden, mysterious women are popping out of portals. Talk about a male fantasy. If only. She wore this outfit that kind of looked like it was made out of a false leather. It looked like animal hide, and as well as some plants. It would look like something out of what you would expect early humans to have worn in colder climates. I don't know exactly if it was animal hide. It just seemed like it was made to look like that. And honestly, this woman, she was beautiful. She looked like she was from Middle Eastern descent. She had long black hair that went down to her hips. She had these kind of gorgeous hazel kind of eyes. As much as sounds like I'm setting up for a male fantasy, any potential thought of that was immediately diverted by this intense vibe that was coming off of this woman. She wasn't anything evil. You could just feel that she was ancient. That if she had to, if she knew some things, that could probably mess me up. I take a moment to process everything. Well, obviously, I go to ask her, "Who are you?" She looks at me, gives this kind of little smile, and says, "I've been known by a lot of names, but the one you may know me better by is Eve. And I hear you've been fighting with my son." Immediately, I started to panic, have this adrenaline start shooting through me. I don't know how this is going to go. A part of me felt like, say I was a cowboy in an old Western. I needed to have my hand on my gun and the hammer pulled back because it felt like somebody was going to get ready to start shooting. I didn't know what was going to happen. I don't know if I was about to deal with the world's oldest mama bear or what. I didn't know what to think. I mean, yeah, there was, angels, gods, demons. Yeah, they're out there in some capacity, but this one I was never expecting. She starts to walk up to me, and as she comes closer, I start to feel myself settling down. I didn't feel that adrenaline rush anymore for some reason. She looks at me again and says, "I'm not here to hurt you. I know what you're capable of, There's been a lot of people watching you ever since Vapula. And so I know for that you were going to be the one person I needed to talk to the most. I know you figured out who my son is. I know you figured out what he was doing. But there's other things that you need to know if you're going to go down this path. I asked her what she meant. She didn't give me this long story. Instead, she goes to bring her fingers up to my temple. She wasn't very tall. She looked to be about 5'10". She brings her fingers up to my temple, and I start to see visions right away from what I can only assume was the Garden of Eden. I do believe I saw glimpses of Enki and Enlil, but that was not the part of the story I needed to see. Everything I could see was through Eve's eyes. She showed me that Cain wasn't Adam's biological son, that Enlil had something to do with it. Enlil attacked her, which lines up with some of the mythos around Cain and Abel. One could argue that those variations of the mythologies are mankind's attempt to try to understand how Cain could have been capable of what he did. But I had no feeling that I should not trust this woman. Vision continues. She showed me that Adam was well aware Cain was not his. And he was detached, almost had a bit of an abusive stepfather attitude towards Cain. And Cain noticed that something wasn't right, that his dad acted different around him. Abel came around, and it seemed like the younger brother was being given favor. And being the younger sibling, got to be kind of annoying about it. Enlil saw this anger. Knowing what I know now, it could be that he saw the familiar patterns that turned Marduk onto his side, and he provoked him. The stories of the sacrifices, the wheat, that Cain would offer up a wheat while Abel would offer up animals, God choosing Abel's sacrifices over Cain, it only aggravated him even more. That resentment built till one day, Abel got snippy, got to be the annoying little brother. And as brothers do, Cain started to fight, started to beat up his little brother. But only this time, the rage, he couldn't hold back anymore. The next thing I remember from Eve's eyes, from Eve's heart, was regret. Something that she carried over till that very day. Regret. She regretted not doing enough. She felt like she could have done more, obviously. She was Cain's mother. She's going to feel like that. She felt like her inability to act was seen as an act of betrayal towards Cain. That Cain saw it like that. So he left the garden, continued killing. That's where she fully believed that Enlil took on his full influence. Started using Cain, the fact that he was part human, to stalk the mortal world, to kill, to find others who had the capacity to take the life of someone they loved, to have that rage in them, to recruit them for an army. And over time, Cain got more and more creative about his methods. After one particular incident, using the information I helped provide, a demonologist contact of mine speculated that Cain was the inspiration behind the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, death. For he rode a pale horse, and hell followed with him. The vision stopped, and Eve was starting to cry. I wanted to reach out and give her a hug, but I didn't know if it was appropriate. She started to walk a little closer, and eventually I did. I gave her a couple moments, then I asked her, "Why did you just show me that?" She reiterated, "There was things you needed to know about Cain if you continued down this way. Things that you needed to know about why he was the way he is." She looked at me and said, "You honestly kind of remind me of him. How he could have been. Just remember what I showed you. You're going to do what you're going to have to do. And I know that I can't stop you, but please just remember what I showed you." That's
when the portal was back and she left. It was scary to think about that. It was overwhelming. Even as I'm telling this story now, I'm feeling myself race. Only one other person said something like that to me. One of my aunts, my dad's side, one of my dad's sisters, once told me that what she saw in me was how she saw my father could have been if he had a chance, if he had someone actually looking out for him. What I was going to do with this information, I don't know. But if anything, it gave me a clue on how to deal with this if it ever came to a final showdown between me and Kane. Because it goes without saying, there was a showdown that, looking at it from a supernatural perspective, wasn't going to be enough. The part that made him the most dangerous, and the part that was his greatest vulnerability, was that even though he was influenced by Enlil, the part of him that would be his greatest weakness was the fact that he was still human. If you would have told me that would go up against this thing, I would have thought you were crazy. You would have told me how bad this thing would get, I would have thought you were exaggerating. There's numerous sources that poke fun at what it's publicly known as, saying that it shouldn't be anything to worry about. But when you're caught in a fight, when you're watching people die, people being taken from you, people losing their life, losing their minds, you can't help but feel a sense of hopelessness, feel a sense of dread, even personal responsibility. I continued my research, thinking that this was nothing more than a supernatural bully. Eve's advice would have been slowly forgotten, as I didn't realize what it meant at the time. Perhaps that's something she would anticipate. After all, she is supposed to be the first mother, right? With the pandemic, I decided to dedicate a majority of my free time trying to put together movies. Something I've always wanted to do. I figured if I spun things just right, I could use the documentary process as a way to truly dive deep into the subjects I wanted to look into without restriction. After Vapula, a sigil I designed on a whim for supernatural protection seemed to gain much more influence. People who would utilize it would report almost immediate benefit. Some would even report seeing me in their dreams, or what they thought were dreams. There was even a couple small children who referred to me as the Nightlight. Children that were being targeted by beings similar to Kane's description, harassed, injured, even almost murdered. The first film I ever produced on my own accord was called The Hunt for Olivia, something that would help me try to understand the situation about my daughter that much more, try to dig more into the phenomenon. The second film was titled Bonds of Beyond, something that was meant to help research the overlaps between UFO and spiritual phenomenon. The third film was going to be titled Lord of Shadows, but it seemed that the attention I was brewing on this thing was only an invitation for it to attack. I had come across several reports. There were people who claimed that they saw the Hat Man as they knew him within weeks of a loved one meeting a tragic death. Others who would purposely overdose themselves on Benadryl try to see this thing. It seemed like the best person for the job to understand this thing, to go after it, was someone who knew how to cheat death. I even had ex-girlfriends question my sanity, ask why it wasn't me that had to go after these things. Ironically, the same ex-girlfriend would report that this being became protective of her, locked her away in a bathroom, then charged at her then boyfriend with a knife, even slicing him open. His injuries weren't fatal, but they were deep enough to leave a scar. In spite of her efforts to convince me otherwise, hearing this encounter only intrigued me that much more. By December of 2020, there was already a bit of turmoil
going about in my life that did sidetrack me from my goals just a bit. As I had learned, one of my cousins had been admitted into a mental asylum after trying to get help from the fact that her stepfather was abusing her. Her own mother tossed her out. Said she couldn't come home unless she said she lied. It was also at this time that I joined an international paranormal research team, who I won't name in this. It is with this group I actually met Chris, my co-host on the Bald and Bonkers show. And quickly, I rose to the ranks, as did Chris. The criteria wasn't very strict. We were mainly ones that actually tried to participate in things that were going on. Eventually, Chris and I started doing shows for the company together to try to help raise it some money. And that is how we started to realize that we bounced off of each other pretty well. Fast forward to February 12th, 2021. I would never forget these dates. I was filming for my second movie, Bonds of Beyond, and I decided to take a little trip out of town for the weekend before Valentine's to see an old friend that I hadn't seen in a few years. Was I expecting anything romantic to happen? No. Would I have been against it? Not really. But it had been a few years since we saw each other, so at most it was going to be a friendly catch-up while I was working a case in the area. One of the live streams took a rather interesting turn. I was staying at this little cabin resort, barely able to find a Wi-Fi signal to attend the live streams. But I did, to try and help. And one of the people in our group, I believe it was our CEO at the time, wanted to address a case that he's somehow never heard of before, involving the Hat Man. What caught me by surprise is that it seemed like this was such a well-known phenomenon that anybody who has had an extensive amount of time dealing with any sort of supernatural research likely would have come across this case. Being that he knew that I had some prior experiences with this thing, he asked me what my input was. In the live chat, people would start to report seeing shadows around me in the background. For those of you who have followed the main talk show for a while, know that I kept an EMF device near me. This was where the idea for it got started. I told him my theory that I was working on involving the Hat Man's true identity, that it was Cain. Needless to say, that thing was not happy. You could probably guarantee that judging off of the severity of the attacks alone, I struck a nerve. I got too close, and this was payback. Starting with a member that was based out of the UK who wasn't directly on the live stream, I received a text message from him saying, I don't want to freak out anybody, but I'm coughing up blood, and my neck is burning. You move from the UK down to the US. We had one woman started to lose her voice. You could start to see her neck start to constrict, as if something we couldn't directly see on camera was tying itself around it. Then you would see that she was watching something. Something had caught her attention off screen. She had to cut herself off of the feed. She was located down in Texas. I started to feel a sensory overload. I could feel my spine start to tingling. There was this electric sensation running up and down it, almost paralyzing. I had to cut myself off from the stream in order to gather myself, analyze the situation, try to understand what the fuck was happening. I had a spirit box recording going off at the entire time, and people in the chat were saying there was growling, there was voices. This was something out of a horror film that had happened to possession. Moving from myself, the attacker moved itself up to Canada, where you could see a dark shadow figure with a wide brim hat and a long trench coat standing behind him. At one point during the feed, he goes to look behind him because his dog is acting up. His dog is freaking out about something. Next thing you notice, couldn't directly see it on camera, but you could hear air filters for it. He had a series of fish tanks in the background, one of which had sharks. He looks behind him, and all of a sudden he notices one of his sharks is belly up. He goes to take a closer look at it, and there was this bruise right in the middle of the shark, like someone just physically just pummeled it. After I cut myself off from the feed, there was only 3 left, one of which started to get intimidated. They started trying to talk about saying a moment of silence, a moment of prayer for the people that were hit hard by this thing. And the guy with the pet shark,
you saw a shift in his eyes. He would approach himself the camera like this, looking directly into the lens, as the other gentleman was talking, and this was bothering him. I'm trying my best to avoid mentioning names, because we all didn't exactly leave on the best of terms. One of the final gentlemen to leave the call, you saw that he was physically getting disturbed, so he signed himself off. But while he was speaking, he goes to mention my name quickly, just kind of recapping everything that was happening. This other man who was focusing himself into the lens of his camera starts grinning. All of a sudden, you notice there was a flinch. I was watching the feed as it happened. The second I saw that, I knew that there was an opening. There was a way to end this. I started saying messages to the CEO, hoping that he would see it, basically saying, Chris, you need to let me in as soon as possible. I think I can end this. The other guy goes to sign off, and he happens to mention my name again. Once again, the guy flinches. The possessed guy starts to flinch. I come on the screen, and you could tell this thing was pissed when it saw me. I focused right back into the camera myself and said, I know who you are. I know what you want. Leave him alone. Get out of him now. All the possessed guy does is this. CEO of the group, he couldn't believe what was happening before his eyes. He was trying to cut it off right then and there, end the stream, but he was frozen. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. I go to say something else, and as my voice left my lips, you could hear it change. There was a reverberation, a change in pitch. It was much deeper, but it sounded like something else was speaking with me. I just looked at it and said, now. From behind this man you could briefly see what looked like a shadow rush out from behind him, tuck away somewhere in the darkness. The connection was severed. Pulls away from the camera. You see him start sweating like crazy. He's taking off his shirts just to try to cool off. And then we know he was back. Tried getting him to talk about what he saw. All he said was, Dakota, you already know. That thing does not like you. I wish I could play you the clips. I thought I had him saved in my own personal files, but something happened to him to where the genuine action was gone. And the YouTube channel that hosted this live session got taken down. It's probably going to be some of you that think convenient. It got taken down, huh? There's some people that have been following my ventures since those days who saw that mess. If you're watching this on YouTube, you're probably seeing some of their remarks in the chat right now. There's some that even tried to fulfill some egotistical delusion, tried to say that they had a major part in breaking that connection, but no, they didn't. That was all me. I didn't know why it responded the way it did. There was, some who tried to say that I had some connection to the Archangel Michael, and that's how I was able to break it. There were some even who claimed that whenever the name of Michael gets mentioned, there's a physical change in my eye, almost a gleam in my eye, a change in my stature. There were some even who claimed that they were saved by Archangel Michael and remarked that he and I looked kind of similar, like we were related somehow. On the 13th of February, we learned that the onslaught wasn't over. In fact, it only got worse when we were introduced to one of our more popular guests on the Bald and Bonkers show, Mike the Naked Bigfoot Coleman. This was actually how we first met. For some reason, when Mike was brought on the live, my connection was not wanting to hold. Now, at the time, I didn't think much of it. I was in a spotty area to begin with. I could watch the live just fine, but as far as actually attending the show, something was up. Something kept me cut off when Mike showed up. And another thing that brought Mike to our interest was the weird interference that came from his end. Some of you who have watched the show know that for some reason, there would be points where Mike's voice would change. Not that he was possessed, but if we had known better, we would have suspected that the guy may have had a soundboard or something running. For some reason, while on the show, sometimes his voice would sound like he had his mic run through a soundboard and he had auto-tune turned on to the highest setting. Or for others who may not understand that reference, it was almost like he was talking through a tin can. But that particular day, there was other voices with him. Jarbled, staticky, literally sounded like something out of an alien invasion movie. While trying to tune out the speakers on the live and trying to focus in on the static, there was one message that was clearest as day. We want Dakota Frandsen here now. With Mike, one of the more interesting aspects of him was that not only was he a practicing voodoo priest, but that his land was also frequently attacked by alleged Sasquatch, and he had the evidence to back it up.
that something massive was stalking his land, taking his livestock, taking his produce, even ripping the sides off of his house. Mike fully believed that the voices coming through were the furry assholes, as he called them. Whether or not it was actual Sasquatch that was making that noise, I don't know. But whatever he did worked, cut off the voices. But the shadows still remained. The attacks still persisted. Between my presence in this group and the fact that an official global investigation was attempted to try to understand what this thing was, and a true all hands on deck scenario to try to figure out who and what this thing was, how it worked, how it functioned. This thing didn't like the attention, apparently. Or if it did, it wanted the story to be told how it wanted, not how we decided. I warned that this particular being seemed to be capable of things that would render any formal investigation methods moot, that it seemed to be able to move through multi-dimensional travel. It seemed to not be working alone and could manipulate forces outside of even a genuine medium's perception. It wasn't until the scale of these attacks that the official investigation was cut off. However, Dakota's not one to back down from a fight. During my time with this group, I had put together psychological profiling and background checks of at least 40 different subjects that brought the most information into this case to help me get a better perspective on what was going on. 3 subjects, investigators on the team who were part of the lives at some point, were the most affected. Subject number 1 was the possessed individual, subject D. D was an older male, 20 plus years of investigation knowledge, seemed to have previous issues with depression, and was also on and off of cancer treatments. Within 2 weeks after the ACE attacks, his cancer came back. Subject S, who was based out of Texas at the time of, I believe, Hurricane Harvey, she was left behind with babysitters. She had suicidal tendencies, history of depression, possible drug use at some point, and some rather disturbing patterns that would come to light later. Then there was Subject a practicing Satanist who believed she had direct lines with none other than Lilith and Lucifer.
I know there will be some of you who question this next story. There will be some of you who will not bother to listen to this tale, immediately assuming that I had been compromised by some deity. That the following tale is nothing more than a tale of sympathy for the dark forces, to allow them into your lives, to cause havoc, to cause chaos, to cause carnage. I highly advise you to actually listen to what I have to say. And if you're one of those types who is going to be eager to try to stir up trouble without even listening to a word I've had to say so far, then I advise you, turn off this video, find something that is more of your comfort. Because I am relaying what has happened. Not for entertainment, not for fame, but to teach. As much as we want to praise a happy ending, manifesting a positive outcome through all this insanity, we must not ignore the reasons why everything had to unfold the way it has. We must acknowledge what happened in the darkness to help remind the future generations who will be doomed to repeat very similar mistakes of why we are sitting within the light. We must teach everything, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us, so we know to be better. I do not regret my actions in the tales that follow. I did what I thought was right. I did what I thought was best to help innocent people. Could it have gone wrong? Oh yeah, deadly. So consider that my warning before you judge this next segment. Subject A was a member of the Satanic Temple, which is not as much of a concern as many people assume. Yes, it utilizes satanic imagery, but is a non-theistic movement. Essentially, to offer a level playing field for those who are often outcasted by society. However, this particular subject showed great promise, showed a stronger disposition towards psychic ability. Like I said, she had entities tied to her that chose to identify themselves as Lilith and Lucifer. Were these, in fact, the Lucifer and Lilith from biblical history? Maybe. It is also very possible that these are simply namesakes. There have been several reports of genuine individuals who have encountered these beings, these attachments, and referred to them by whatever name happened to pop into mind, whatever seemed to fit. And these beings simply went with it, knowing that the individual they were watching over, they were trying to help, would likely not be able to pronounce their true names accurately. It is no different than some Asian cultures choosing to pick English names for when they visit or choose to move to Western countries. The same concept. I knew of Subject A's attachments when I met her, and honestly I didn't care. Perhaps on some level, it was because my personal judgments were askewed. Subject A and I were about the same age. She was literally a month older than me. Had similar backgrounds, similar interests. Truth be told, combine that with the mentality I was in during this time frame, shouldn't be too surprising to say that I started to develop feelings for her. I spoke to her frequently, tried to understand why it is she chose the lifestyle she chose. And like many others who choose to adapt the satanic imagery, it is because the side of light, quote unquote, proved to be abusive, pushed them towards very dark means of escape. And these beings came forward to stop her, to help her live on. Something I'd identified with rather uniquely. And yes, part of it was to scope out whether or not she already had a boyfriend. After these attacks, Subject A was the only one in group, in-house, to admit that she has had previous experiences with Cain, involving being pushed down a flight of stairs, practically being tortured, and after the attacks took place, she was being hunted. She was one of the more sensitive members of the group, one of the more genuine ones, I would say. Others tried to claim the psychic label, but quite frankly, I feel they're full of shit. They had no clue what they were talking about. After the attacks transpired, I started to reach out a little more, just to make sure she was okay. And slowly, she was starting to turn back around, only to find out that there was a high reason for her quick recovery. Her return to normalcy was because a little girl was visiting her. She looked to be about the age of 6, had long blonde hair, big blue eyes. Oh, and she looked like a spitting image of me. My daughter had started to manifest herself to everyone who was most affected by the attacks. Subject A is given focus due to some developments that she inadvertently helped uncover. For the man who was battling cancer on and off, visitations from this little girl helped him start to recover from his cancer that started to reemerge after these attacks within a matter of a couple weeks. When my daughter started to show herself to Subject A, her mentality started to improve to where she felt comfortable returning to the job. She was one of the only few who knew the story right away about my daughter. She recognized her right away. because she could physically see my daughter, speak to her, even utilize spirit boxes to capture her voice, at which she would send me during our chats, and I would recognize it right away. Because this relationship started to show promise, there was one movement I had to contribute in order to help clear the mental blocks, if you will, with Subject A. I was sitting in my office one night, then all of a sudden, through a television that was turned off, I started to notice a face. Fairly attractive looking, somewhat androgynous. The vibrations I felt from this thing were off. Not necessarily in an evil sense, but it was someone that was very troubled. This thing identified itself. Said, "Please do not freak out. I came because I need your help, Dakota." I asked him, "Well, who are you, first off?" He said, "I am the one A refers to as Lucifer, and I need your help to help her. I know what you're capable of. I know who you are." Being that it identified itself as Lucifer, naturally, I had my reservations, if you will, and he was expecting it. He looks at me dead in the eye, said, "I want you to look into me so you know I'm telling the truth. I know that you care about A nearly as much as I do. That's why I'm coming to you, because you may be able to help her in ways I cannot. I'm not looking to trick you. I am not looking to harm you in any way. You're the only one I can trust for this." Immediately, I started to dig into this thing's mind, for lack of a better word. I could tell he had been watching over her since she was a young girl, that he deeply cared for her, and that what he was asking me was no trick. Subject A had spent some time in a mental institution, and many of us held back on reaching out, just so she could focus on getting better. And me being the type to not have some sort of confirmation that someone I care about is alright, a part of me honestly started to panic, a habit I've been trying to break for quite some time now. Gotten better at it, but it also didn't mean that if I were to somehow be presented an opportunity to step in and help, that I wouldn't take it in a heartbeat. And this was such an opportunity. So I agreed. I agreed to help Lucifer. He started to explain to me that the one who identified herself as Lilith was attacked, and it was vicious, possibly by Cain himself, or at least someone very close, and that she was more or less missing. Subject A, in our personal chats, as I started to get her to open up a bit more, even admitted that she hadn't felt Lilith's presence. So it was natural that I went in to look. Lucifer reaches out to me. The next thing I know, I'm in this, what looks like dark caverns. It looked like I was somewhere deep underground. Whether this was an astral transport or what, I'm not sure. The lines have been blurred on being able to tell the difference for some time now, in most cases. It's gotten to be a little easier in recent months, but nevertheless, I remember flying in to these caverns. It was absolutely dark. The walls looked like they were made from magma. They would have this sort of drooping to them. I could hear whispers. I could hear what sounded like someone very scared of being in my presence. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear a woman's cries. The only light in these, when we first arrived, seemed to be coming off of me. Whether this was a brief visit to a lower density plane, maybe it would check out. Coming from a higher density location, especially with my history, it is very well possible that the natural EMF that the human body gives off could potentially seem to make me glow in certain conditions. Lucifer was never far behind me. We would walk down these caves. It was almost like the formation seemed like it was made of, there was physical steps leading down to what looked like some sort of den. I could hear the sound of running water. There was some sort of river. I could hear the sound of waterfalls in the distance. Briefly, as I would observe my surroundings, I could see the evidence of water, marked up by what looked like sediment. The entire feeling of this place was uneasy. You just simply felt lost. Seemed like a literal manifestation of darkness. Of genuine, horrific, isolating darkness. Eventually, there was a point Lucifer had to stop. Said, "This is as far as I can go. Something is blocking me." I look around and I start to notice that parts of the walls had plant life that seemed to have a bioluminescent factor to it. And I've continued to further down into the caves, further into this den. We're inside, sleeping on what looked like a makeshift bed made of rocks. There was a mostly naked woman. You could tell that she had been harmed. She had marks all over her, like she had been beaten, and not just fresh ones. She had a history. I whisper her name to get her attention, to slowly ease into it, and she practically flew away. She was that scared. But the second she saw me, she recognized me because of Subject A. She calmed down a bit. I asked her if I could approach. She said yes. This woman, her physical appearance, she had tan skin, but she looked like she could have been Subject A's biological mother. That was the first clue of what was really going on. There was a moment where I started to extend my hands out to her, just to simply give her a hug, to which she hesitantly accepted. The second I could feel her pressing against my chest, she started to bawl her eyes out. I told her that Lucifer had brought me here because he was worried about her. And that's when she told me what happened. Lilith may have not. This is why I said that this Lucifer and Lilith may not in fact be the Lucifer and Lilith, but rather other beings that took on the manifestation, that worked with the delusion, if you will. They utilized Subject A's interest within the Satanic Temple to be able to manifest themselves to her as protectors. They were, in fact, her soul family, or at least imprints of them. Psychic imprints that everybody has that can essentially be used to telepathically communicate with loved ones. Aspects of their memories that our minds can use to essentially create dreams, to create psychic connections, to be able to reach out to these through ethereal means. Lucifer even identified himself. He had admitted to Subject A that she was his daughter. Cain had sent someone to attack Subject A. Lucifer was blocked off. Lilith was not. And like several times within Subject A's life, Lilith took control. There was an aspect of dissociative identity disorder to this particular manifestation. And I say that there was an aspect to it because you can capture Lucifer Lilith's voice on tape, something you're not supposed to be able to do if it was a manifestation of psychological disorder, or if that was the case. And Subject A was a lot more powerful than she realized. She took the brunt of the hits, and she was rattled to the point that she got scared, essentially locked herself away. Whenever Lucifer would manifest Subject A, they would always take her to what looked like these dark caverns. Go deep enough, there was these big chambers that looked like underground gardens. Somehow there was prosperous plant life. There was running water. You could even hear little critters scurrying about if you sat quietly enough. Exactly where this was, I don't know. Part of me theorized that this was a psychological manifestation, which means, if that being the case, it means that Lucifer projected himself just enough to allow me literally inside Subject A's head. Something I've been known to be able to do with a few of my ex-girlfriends when they were going through some troubling times. When Lilith was finished telling me what had happened, why she seemingly abandoned Subject A, I focused in on her eyes and told her that I was slowly working on a plan to take Kane out of the picture. But in order to make sure I could fulfill that plan, I needed her help to keep an eye on Subject A. Subject A was based out of Ontario, Canada, while I'm in Southern Ireland. Being able to just drop by for a little house visit tends to be a little bit more on the difficult side. She assured me that in a couple days, she would be ready to come back. And that's when I walked out and started to walk away towards Lucifer, and he brought me back to where I was, as promised. Before I had a chance to get distracted, I left a message with A, saying, Lucifer just stopped by. We found Lilith. Give her a couple days. She was attacked and she was pretty rattled. But give her a couple days and she should be back. Whether this event, me saying this, acted as an unconscious invitation to let Lilith back into Subject A's life, that can be up for debate. It is highly possible. But Subject A had a mother-like relationship with Lilith, and if that were to suddenly be taken away, especially when there was some vicious killer trying to attack us, that would only compromise her more. I knew that it was highly possible that Lucifer and Lilith would eventually disappear when Subject A was ready, mentally. And that was a process I had to let flow naturally as much as possible. Over the next few weeks, I started to gather a bit more of a plan. Another subject, I believe S, I referred to her in the last segment, she presented another interesting dilemma, where it seemed to Kane had left her babysitters, individuals meant to keep an eye on her and the rest of the team, and they were given full permission to harass her, to make her life a living hell. That's where I launched my plan of attack. I had to make some sort of move to start breaking the connections from my teammates so that way they could come back into full force and we could think of something together in the long run. But I had to get the eyes off of us. Knowing Kane's mission to essentially bring hell on earth, to help instigate the war that would inspire revelations, Ragnarok, whatever term you want to use for the more Christian depictions of Armageddon, the end of the world. I knew that his plan was ego-based. His motivations were ego-based. So, I offered him a bargain I knew he couldn't refuse. Not my soul, no. Something much more effective. I offered him something that would allow him to torture, to maim, to frighten as many people as possible without having to lift a single finger. I offered him a chance to fulfill his plans, a chance for him to unknowingly have access to potentially millions of victims. Remember that documentary I was going to make about him? Figured that would be the perfect opportunity. So, utilizing a spirit box to be able to record genuine responses, to be able to physically hear his voice, agree to the terms. I offered this. I called Kane myself, and I pitched him the idea. Said, I know what it is you want. You have something I want. I have something you want. Something that could help you without having to lift a finger. To be able to torment several innocent souls who would be foolish enough to let themselves be tormented. To torture their own minds and give you all the credit. I told him that I would be willing to put together a little documentary that would be sent out to potentially millions of people that would tell his story, his real story, and tell him what he's done, tell him what he's planning to do. All I asked in return was for him to back off my team, pull away all of his agents, leave them be, and make sure I see physical confirmation that they're gone. Then I will fulfill my end of the bargain. I needed to see physical proof that he accepted the terms, and I needed to see it now. Through the voice on the spirit box, he said, I accept, but you better not try anything. The plan was in motion. Within 10 minutes, subject down in Texas sends me a message. Says, I don't know what just happened. but they're gone. And they said something to each other before leaving about the knowing one getting ready to do something. I was the one who figured it out. Kane suspected that I was up to something. He suspected I had plans. And he figured the safest option for him was to play along, find out what my plans would try to stop me. I explained to the rest of my team, without proper protections, that I had planned to do this documentary, but I also had planned to hide subliminal protections that would essentially poison the food supply, if you will. Kane did not like this, so as I was driving home from work one day, I knew he was watching me. I could see him staring outside my workplace, watching me. Others had thought they saw him too, but brushed it off. Hiding from the back seat of my car, which, by the way, I don't have a physical back seat because the previous owner had modified the car I have now for sound competitions and put a gigantic subwoofer box in the place of the back seat. I suppose a small toddler could probably squeeze into there, but that's about it. From the back seat, Kane ambushes me as I'm driving home. Tries to get me into crash, right into a train. And he had a good grip on me, but when I started to realize what was happening, it started to focus on an attack. He jumped ship. It was a reminder that he still had power. It was an intimidation display to try to convince me that if I did not follow through on my end of the bargain, he was going to kill me. But much to his and my surprise, the manifestations of my daughter only became a sign of something much, much more special. Somebody utilizing my daughter as part of the task force, if you will. Somebody had sent reinforcements. And boy, were those revelations something else.